Hi everyone, I hope you're well. So today I'm going to be showing you how to build a stopwatch using React Native. Most of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the functionality of a stopwatch, but our goal is to create the start, stop and reset functionality similar to the ones shown here. Before we get started, there is some setup we need to complete. For this video, I'm going to assume you're familiar with JavaScript. If not, feel free to go ahead and watch some of my other videos. Next, you'll need to make sure that you have a new version of Node installed. We're going to be building our project using 𝐥𝐸. 𝐥𝐸 is a collection of tools to help you get started building apps with React Native. It will help to install the 𝐥𝐸 CLI, which is shown here. So 𝐥𝐸 provides us with a variety of options to build our app, including via the 𝐥𝐸 Go app, which can be downloaded from the App Store or from Google Play. Using these apps means you can scan a QR code, which is provided when we build our app, and then you can run it on your own device. The other option is through simulators and emulators on your machine. To use this approach, which is what I'll be doing, you first need to set up Xcode and Android Studio. To set up Xcode, you need to download it from the App Store on your Mac. And to download Android Studio, you need to download it directly from this web page shown here. These steps can take a while, but once they're done, they're extremely useful for developing apps. We'll start creating the React Native project. I'll do this using yarn. So I'll say yarn create 𝐥𝐸 app and then the name of the project, which is Stopwatch, and then press enter. This will take a while, so pause the video and let your setup finish. Once this is done, you need to navigate into your project directory. So we'll say cd for change directory and the project name, which is Stopwatch. Then you can open the project in your preferred text editor. Now we'll try building the project on a simulator. You can use any platform here, but I'm doing this on iOS, so I just say yarn iOS. Again, you may want to pause the video whilst this runs, as it can take some time. So let's have a quick look at the bare-bone project that 𝐥𝐸 created for us. So we have a package.json file with a few dependencies installed and some configuration. We also have an app.js file with some basic layout and styles. At this point, you should have the app.js file open and a simulator running, so we can all start from the same place. The first thing I'm going to do is change the text just to say hello. I'll save this and open the running simulator, and we can see the reload has taken place, and I now see the message hello on the screen. Next, we're going to create a directory called components, which will store our screens or components for our project. Inside the directory, I'm going to create a file called stopwatch.js, and this will be for our stopwatch. Let's open our stopwatch file and import some things we need for our component. So we'll import React from React, and then we'll import some core components from React Native. So we'll import view, text, touch pull opacity, and style sheet. Next, let's create our component, which will be a function component called stopwatch. So we'll start by saying return and use a set of parentheses. We're going to start by adding a view for the container. And inside this, we'll add another set of views. Inside of these, we're going to add some text. And we'll use the text time. This will be like our title for our stopwatch. Next, we're going to add another set of views. These will contain our buttons. And then we're going to use touchable opacity as a wrapper for the touch response. When you press down using touchable opacity, the view dims, so it's clear it's responding to the user's touch. We're also going to add some text for our button. We'll give this a message start. We now need to do this again, but for our stop and reset buttons. Now we can move on to adding some styles. So we say const styles equals stylesheet.create, and we pass in an object inside of parentheses. We're going to start with the container for our stopwatch. So we're going to say justify content center, align items center, and we'll also say flex of 1. Let's go ahead and add this to the view. We also don't need to wrap our text in another set of views, so we'll delete these. Now let's go ahead and add some styling to our text. We'll call this time text. So we're going to give this a font size of 60, a colour of pink, and a margin bottom of 20. So we'll give this a width of 100%, flex direction of row, justify content to be space around, and align items center, and align south center. Now we're ready to go and add some styles to our buttons. We'll use one set of styles but apply it to each button. So we'll say justify content of center. We'll give it a background colour, a border radius of 35, a height of 75, width also 75, text align to be center, and align items center. Now we also need to go and add the text styles for our button. Again, these will be applied to each of the individual buttons. And we'll call this button text. We'll give this font size of 25 and a font weight to be bold. So let's go back to our app.js file, and now we can import our stopwatch component. So we just say import stopwatch from components stopwatch. And then we just add it into the view. So let's go ahead and load the app in the simulator so we can see what we've done so far. We've got the basic UI layout. It doesn't actually do anything at the moment, but the basic structure is in place. If we look at our stopwatch file, we can see we've got a container for the view. We've also got the time text, and then we've got our 3 buttons. So we've got a start button, a stop button, and the reset button. Let's go ahead and add a few styles to our app.js file. We're going to delete the current styles, aside from the flex one, and change the background colour to be navy. We'll also add some styles to the text called title. We'll change the text for the title to be my stopwatch. And we'll give this text a colour of white, font size of 30, font weight of bold, align cell to be centre, and a margin top of 40. Let's reload this in the simulator. So it's already looking a lot better. Now we can start going ahead and adding some of the time functionality to our stopwatch. So let's go back to our stopwatch.js file. So we're going to start by importing some hooks. Essentially, hooks are features in React Native which provide us with some functionality for our functional component without using a class. We're going to add useState and useEffect. useState lets us track state, such as values or properties, and useEffect lets us manage side effects, such as fetching data or updating the DOM directly. So let's start with useState. We're going to set 2 values, one for tracking the time for the stopwatch, which we'll call time, and one for tracking whether or not the stopwatch is running. We'll call this one active. When you use useState, you pass in 2 values, the current state and the function that updates the state. You then also initialize the state with a value such as null, 0, or an empty string. We're going to initialize the time with 0, and we'll set the active state as false, because when the screen loads, the stopwatch will not be running. Next, we're going to set up useEffect. So useEffect takes 2 parameters, the function to run and the dependency. useEffect runs on every render, and of course the render triggers useEffect to run again. So the dependency parameter provides us with a way to manage this. We can pass in a value, and when that value changes, only then will the re-render happen. In our useEffect, we're going to use a JavaScript function from the web API called setInterval. setInterval calls the function you pass in at the interval you specify. So we say useEffect, and now we'll create a variable for the interval. And now we'll use an if block, so we only run the code if the stopwatch is active. Now we use setTime to set the time, and we'll increment this by 1 each time that this runs. If the stopwatch is not active, we're going to call clear interval to clear the time of our stopwatch. We'll also use this as the useEffect return function, and this acts as cleanup for the function. Lastly, for our dependency, we're going to base this on active. So now this is done, we can update our UI. We'll change the text to show the time, so we need to use curly braces here. Next, we can add the onPress functionality for each of our buttons. So for the Start button, we're going to say set active, and we'll pass in true, because the stopwatch will be active once you press Start. For the Stop button, we'll repeat this again, but this time we're going to pass in set active, with false, because when you stop, the stopwatch is no longer active. And then for the Reset button, we do this again, but this time we're going to set the time to be 0. So let's save this and run the simulator again. Our buttons now work and the time value is displayed. The next thing we need to do is to create some formatters so that the time displays correctly, as you see in a stopwatch, so in hours, minutes and seconds. You're welcome to experiment with a library here, such as Moment.js, but I'm going to do this with vanilla JavaScript. We're going to start by creating a function. This will make sure that the values display with at least a length of 2 digits. We're going to take the number and call the toString method. We'll then use pad start and pass in 2 and 0. We also need to pass in a parameter for the function, which will be number. So next we'll format our time. We set a parameter called ms, and firstly we need to set our variables for seconds, minutes, and hours. For seconds, we're going to call math.floor and pass in milliseconds divided by 1000. We'll do this again for minutes, but this time we'll pass in seconds divided by 60. And we'll do this again for hours, but this time we pass in minutes divided by 60. We want the hours to carry over, but we don't want this to happen for minutes and seconds. So for minutes and seconds, we'll use the modulo operator to calculate the remaining value. Lastly, there are 1000 milliseconds in a second, so we use this for the milliseconds and divide it by 10 to get how many tenths are in the second. So we go ahead and we declare a variable. We use the math.floor again, and we'll pass in milliseconds modulo 1000 divided by 10. So now we can format the display using template literals and interpolate in the values. We only display the values if hours are greater than 0. So firstly, we use format val, and we pass in mins. We do this again, but pass in seconds. And then we do this again, and then pass in the milliseconds. Next, we say if hours is greater than 0, then set the time string equal to format val with hours, and then the rest of the time string. We also need to return this. Now we can update our time text to use this formatter. Let's save this. So let's launch this in the simulator. Now when we press start, we can see the time is formatted correctly. The other buttons also work, so when we press stop, the time stops incrementing, and reset resets it to 0. So now we have our app running, let's do some refactoring so our code is nicer. In our stopwatch, we're repeating the touchable opacity code each time we create a button. So instead, let's go ahead and create a new button component, and we can just use this for each of our buttons. So I'm going to start by creating a new file, and I'm going to call this file button.js. Now in the file, I'm going to do some basic setup. So I'll import React from React, and I'll import touchable opacity, text, and style sheet from React Native. Now let's create the component. And we'll also set up the style sheet. So I just say const styles equals stylesheet.create, and I pass in an object inside of parentheses. We'll also set up the return for the view. So I'm going to go back to the stopwatch file, and I'm going to copy and paste one of the buttons from the stopwatch file and paste it into the button so we can refactor this. I'll also grab the styles that are needed for the button. So we're going to use a prop for onPress, and we'll use a prop called message for the button text. So now let's update our code to use these props. And we also need to get the styles for the button text. Now we can go ahead and delete these from the stopwatch file. We're going to keep the button container in the stopwatch file because this will be used to wrap the buttons. So now we can go ahead and import the button component into our stopwatch. And we can also update the individual buttons to now use our button component. So for the start button, we need to pass in onPress, and we also need to pass in a message for the start text. So we can delete our start button there. And now we need to repeat this again for the stop button. So we pass in onPress, and then we also pass in stop for the message. Let's delete our old stop button. And we'll do this again for the reset button. We pass in onPress, and also the message, which will be reset. Let's delete our old reset button. So now we're ready to go ahead and we can give this a go in the simulator to check our updates worked. Everything looked okay, so next we're going to go ahead and do some refactoring to our button components. We're going to use something called destructuring so that we don't have to keep repeating the word styles every time we implement a style. We'll pass in button and button text, and then we can remove this from the code. Our button component looks good now. Let's go ahead and do a bit of refactoring to the stopwatch. We can do the same thing again. So we pass in container, time text, and button container. And now we can remove all the word styles in the code here. We can also remove some of this excess spacing. And save this. So now let's go back to our app.js file and we'll do the same refactoring here. We'll destructure the container and the title from the styles. Let's save this and run the simulator. Our app is now complete. We've got our working stopwatch functionality. Now obviously this is only the basic functionality for a stopwatch, and you could take the styling much further. You could also implement laps in the stopwatch. I would love to see people's projects and experiments with these projects, so please feel free to share them with me. In the meantime though, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope to see you all again soon. Please like and subscribe for more content.